Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is William Atkinson. I'm the assistant editor here at Conservative Home, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to our latest event, Attracting Younger Voters while Retaining Older Ones, How to Square the Circle, which we're delivering today in partnership with Age UK. It's a quotation, I think, often apocryphally attributed to Winston Churchill, but nevertheless, I shall run through it nonetheless. If a man is not a socialist by the time he is 20, he has no heart. If he's not a Conservative by the time he is 40, he has no head. One of the many problems that the Conservative Party faced at the last election, that I think the average age at which you now become a Conservative is about 64. And if the Conservative Party has any long-term future, it means that, well, pretty much myself, being the only Conservative voter as far as I can tell under the age of about 64, at a pale 24 myself, aside from Lizzie, of course, we need to actually sort of get those numbers up, to misquote, Matthew McConaughey. And so, in the interest of that, today's panel shall focus on attracting young voters while retaining older ones, and I'm very pleased to be joined today by Mel Stride, the MP for Central Devon, but formerly the Secretary of State for Working Pensions, now the Shadow Secretary of State for Working Pensions. Paul Farmer, the Chief Executive of Age UK, Professor Bobby Duffy, who is the Director of the KCL Policy Institute, over a 30-year career in policy research, and Lizzie Hacking, who's a board member of the Next Gen Tories, was candidate in the last election and is the chair of the Conservative Rural Forum. For those of you who haven't attended a Conservative Home event so far at this conference, the format will be quite simple. Each of our panellists will give a 3-minute opening speech, and then I will ask them a couple of rounds of questions, and then we will turn things over to the floor. So without further ado, Mel, can you kick us off?
Well, William, thank you very much, and good afternoon, everybody. And can I thank you for this mural behind me, which makes me look very young. I think you'll agree, so thank you for that. The figure, actually 63, is the average age of a Conservative voter in the last general election, and that is quite an astonishing fact. And in fact, if you look at the under 30s, in 2019, 22% of under 30s voted Conservative. In the last election, it had fallen to just 8%. And I think those statistics alone probably give us as big a challenge as any that we face in terms of coming back into power. And if you ask the question, why is it that we've ended up in this situation? I think fundamentally, the answer is that too many young people no longer think that we are providing them with an appropriate stake in society. So when I grew up in the 1980s, I managed to go out and get onto the housing ladder. It wasn't easy, but if you saved a bit, you could do it. I had an education in which I wasn't loaded up with student debt. Quite the reverse, actually. I was given a grant to go to university and promptly went down the pub and blew most of it behind the bar. But that was the way that it worked in those days. I set up a business, and we had a business environment in which business taxes and other things were favourable to business success, and that really formed the foundations of the rest of my life. And I think one of the big things that has happened since the financial crash of 2008 has been firstly relatively anemic real growth in incomes, which has been detrimental to those of working age, including young people, but also an explosion in the amount of wealth that there is as a percentage of GDP in our country. So between 2008 and 2020, there was an increase of £6 trillion in wealth. So these are assets, these are shares, this is property, and so on. And if you ask the question, well, who benefited from that? It is, of course, predominantly the older members of society that did so. In fact, if you're in the early 60s today, you will be, on average, compared to an equivalent person back in 2008, about £170,000 better off. If you're in your early 30s, however, compared to somebody in a similar situation in 2008, you're going to be £30,000 worse off. So I think this disconnect with wealth is fundamental and assets to solving the problem of attracting more young people. So how do you do it? I think housing is absolutely right at the centre of this. I think on the supply side, we've got to do the kind of things actually that Labour are talking about in terms of speeding up the planning process and getting houses built, particularly in urban areas, brownfield sites, building up. We want to build in these areas because that's where, A, younger people want to live in, but B, it helps in terms of driving what economists call agglomeration effects and therefore productivity, which is one of the big economic challenges that we face as a country. I would also try and scrap stamp duty land tax, which may be a big driver of slowing down property transactions and people downsizing. And I would also look at the fiscal rules that the government works to, which I think this government is about to, in terms of incentivising and recognising that investment expenditure has a particular quality and a need for that. The day-to-day spending arguably does not. And on the demand side, I would look at immigration, because at the moment, the level of house building that we have, which is about 300,000 properties a year is the target, is predicated on about a net migration figure of 170,000. Well, last year it was 680,000. So there's a strong imperative, actually, if you want to provide homes for younger people, to address the issue of net migration. The other thing I would say is on education. I do think we need to have a look at the quality of higher education, weeding out those kind of courses that actually aren't conferring economic value on younger people, and also look at the issue of student loans. And I think, in conclusion, we need to have a very big, bold offer for young people, particularly around housing and education. But if we're going to deliver that, we have to have an economic plan that provides the fiscal space to fund it. And that is going to be some very big decisions around productivity and investment. If we had an economy today that had followed the trend of productivity growth up until the financial crash of 2008, it would be 25% bigger than it is today. If we had an economy that was as productive as Germany and France and the United States, it would be about 20% bigger than it is today. So the roots of this issue, as so many others, is an economic question of how do we get a higher growing, higher productivity economy going forward. And we will learn more at the end of next month when Rachel Reeves tells us what her answers to that are going to be. Thank you.
Very well said, Mel. Paul.
Thanks very much. Good afternoon, everybody. Very good to be here. Well, I suppose you wouldn't be surprised if I was to start off by saying it's probably quite important to pay some attention to today's older people. Not only did they vote, but they also voted in quite large numbers, as they usually do. So they're an important part of everyone's political constituency, but of course they're an incredibly important part of our wider society. So paying attention to today's older people is super important. Tomorrow, in fact, is the International Day of Older People, 1st of October, and it gives us a chance to celebrate the contribution that older people make to our wider society and the contribution that older people make across the world at a time when often older people are facing some very real challenges, whether that's access to healthcare or finances. And of course, we couldn't possibly leave this event without mentioning the winter fuel payment question, which I'm sure people will come back to. So paying attention to today's older people is supremely important. However, Age UK, we are also interested in tomorrow's older people. We anticipate being an organisation that's going to be here for some time to come, unlike other charities which are quite rightly set up to try to see themselves into obsolescence. We know we're going to be here forever. So we do want to pay attention to thinking about what tomorrow's older people are saying. And interestingly, from the work we are increasingly doing, and this may come as news to you, but at Age UK, we've decided that our primary target audience starts at 50. And that's because partly for demographic reasons, but also partly because we are all about thinking about what can you do to take steps to make sure that your later life is as good as it possibly can be. And that 50 plus space is an important demographic to think about. And when we listen to those people, the issues that they identify are issues that, broadly speaking, revolve around your health, your wealth, and your well-being. So how we think about bringing those conversations into the next generation, supporting the next generation to equip themselves for later life is going to be really important. So where does that align in terms of today's debate? Well, the debate, I think, is very much about, first of all, how do we encourage a greater degree of intergenerational conversation? When we were doing our work before the election, when we sat and listened to thousands of older people as we did, the issues that they mentioned were not just issues that affected them. They're actually, a lot of the issues were issues that are affecting their children and their grandchildren. Many older people talked about climate change. They talked about issues about housing, as you've rightly said, issues that were concerning their family as much as they were concerning themselves as individuals. And of course, I think one of the things that the winter fuel payment issue has really highlighted is this quite large group of older people who are living in a state of economic poverty, who are really going to need that extra help. So tackling that, challenging that kind of stereotype, if you like, of all older people are in a great position, they're all fine, they don't need any extra help. Well, we know that's just not true. So in terms of bringing that together, I think the kind of three kind of key areas of health, wealth and well-being are really good places to focus. We know that there needs to be a shift into a more of a conversation about prevention, but what does prevention mean for a 50 to 65-year-old? We know that in financial terms, reaching that group of people who need help most is going to be important. But also, I think, thinking about how, as a society, we start to think about the ageing population, the demographic changes that are really not far down the line, and please do read Chris Whitty's report on an ageing population if you want to understand the huge impact that this will have in 2040 or so, in terms of where the population is distributed, and also in the context of where young people are, or indeed aren't, to be able to provide support to those older people. So lots to get our teeth into in this session, I think. Thank you.
Splendid, and thank you very much. Though I appreciate both our previous panellists doing so, I will make it. You don't have to stand up when talking if you don't so wish. But anyway, Bobby.
Great, thank you, William. Great to be here. So, generationally driven death of Conservative Party has been predicted many times in the past and has never been proven true. I think we are at a riskier point in history than those past times, with the largest gradients we've seen in the last few elections between different age groups. And then questions raised over whether current generations of younger millennials and Gen Z in particular are breaking that political life cycle rule of getting more conservative as they age, as William outlined. We wrote a paper on this on the back of a book I wrote on generations, and the paper was, Are Millennials Really Killing the Tory Party? And you could add that to a long line of things that millennials are supposed to have killed, from marmalade to the napkin industry to the Olympics. So any millennials in the audience should be ashamed of themselves. So I'm just going to run through some of the key points from that, and some are more hopeful than others. The hopeful points are that younger generations are not particularly economically left-leaning in, for example, their support for increased welfare spending if it increases taxation. It's always been older people more likely to support that. Younger generations are at the end of a long trend towards individualism, and they have been shaped by that. They do tend to see things as more down to personal responsibility, and they're not automatically supportive of big state solutions to problems. It's worth remembering too that in the general context of this, the UK is the most individualistic country in Europe when you look at people's values, much closer to the US in its starting point in thinking of individualism rather than solidarity solutions being most important. But the main point is it's always worth remembering that politics changes fast. When we look in academic work at the impact of generations, we try as much as possible to split it into age, period, and cohort effects. So age effects are where you change with your life cycle. We go through different life stages, and the political life cycle effect is a key part of that, where people have tended to get more conservative as they age. Period effects, when something happens and it affects all generations, things like economic crises or the pandemic, or particular offers or behaviours from individual political parties. And then cohort effects are the ones you're left with, which are true generational effects, where something is different between generations and it stays different. I guess the key point is that period effects are very, very powerful in politics, and that you can see that again in loads of other sayings around politics. Events, dear boy, events, or a week is a long time in politics. And I guess that's my main point. The younger generations, as far as we can see from the data, it's not a rejection of the Conservative Party so much as the current offer. And that could change again pretty quickly if the offer changes. And there's two key points within that, echo some of the things we've heard already. The first is that putting culture war issues so close to the centre of politics automatically builds in an age gradient. because it's just young people are inevitably more comfortable with changing social norms on average. And so the woke, anti-woke framing doesn't help the Conservative Party, I'd argue. And there's really steep age gradients in those identities. So we're already in a situation where 31% of men over 60 identify themselves as identify with being anti-woke. And that's a completely new term. It didn't exist in any discourse pre-2019. But it's only 3% of women under the age of 30 who identify themselves as anti-woke. So building in that kind of putting that at the centre of politics is always going to end in that age division. But the second and final point is the real problem is, very much echoes what Mel was saying, is that end of a sense of generation on generation progress, that each generation will do better than the last, that you can expect better for your kids and grandkids than you had for yourself. So back in 2003, half of the UK public thought that young people would have a better life than their parents, and a quarter thought it was going to be worse. And then after the financial crash, and just about every time we've measured it since, only a quarter think it's going to get better and half think it's going to be worse. And within that, some interesting, more recent work by some academics showing that young people are increasingly questioning whether individual effort does lead to economic success, rather than being held back by structural factors or outside forces. And you really, as Conservatives, you don't want that feeling to grow among young people. So in the end, I'm afraid we're dealing with that very big problem that is key to appealing both to younger people and unifying generations, that we're all deeply concerned about that end of progress. And again, as Mel said, this is not a zero-sum game pitting one generation against the other. The real trend here is we're losing a sight of a better future for us all. And that really points to the big picture here is what you would need is a bold vision for restarting generation on generational progress. That is the key to bringing both generations together and to electoral success. Easier said than done, but much, much better than that alternative of a culture war death spiral. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Bobby. That's fascinating. And I suppose on that subject of the expectations of the next generation, who better to speak on that than Lizzie?
Sorry. So just thinking a little bit about the Conservatives' future and how we interact with the younger generation. So we've talked a little bit about the amazing economic benefits that we as a country can see if we empower millennials and below. But I just want to talk to you a little bit about two, I think, quite key political aspects, which are aspiration and representation in politics. So how many of us here have gone canvassing and then you knock on the door and you see somebody under 45 and your heart just naturally sinks? Like, you immediately presume, of course, they're going to have a go at me or hate me or shut the door in my face. And that is so depressing. And actually, that was not where we were before. The Canadian Conservatives are a prime example of how, in today's world, we can turn that around. They had a poll recently where 47% of 18 to 34-year-olds are going to vote Conservative. That is incredible. That is in 2024, and there is no reason why we here in the UK can't replicate that. But if we continue to go down the sort of focus group governing that we do at the moment, where I'm going to take a recent by-election example where I had to turn up, as quite a few of the candidates have done, and you take your photo with a leaflet, because politicians are obsessed with having photos taken with bits of paper, and it was "Save our Greenbelt." And I was just depressed by that, because actually, fine, in the immediate poll in that constituency, when we were fighting quite a challenging battle, that might have been what came out on top. But where is the aspiration? Where's the kind of long-term vision that my generation can get behind and go, actually, fair play, the Conservatives understand? And no longer, you're told when you're at school, if you get really good GCSE results, I think that's how my family tried to get me to behave myself, you're going to go somewhere in life, you're going to then get a good degree, you're going to then get a good job. And I feel like I've done all of those things and I'm still no better off. And that is dangerous. If we're going to be Conservatives, we have to have something to conserve. So either your stake in society by having children, and our birth rate has completely collapsed, or your ability to own property and be completely engaged in a community in that way. So I think we need to bring that aspirational message back to younger people. Then it went talking about representation, because I think that's also a key blocker to why this isn't happening. So we had a letter Next Gen Tories put out today in the Times of all of the new intake of MPs arguing why things like house building and family and lower tax burdens on younger generations were so important. And I'm not going to name names, but the only 4 MPs who did not sign it were those in their 50s and above. So I think that is quite telling that we do actually need people of all levels of government, even the voluntary party, at the table to push this narrative. But I suppose I was talking to my friends this morning. Why would you, if you turn up and you're 18, 19, you've got a bit of an interest in politics, but you're then hanging out with someone who's in their late 70s, like we really do need it. It's a bit of a snowball effect. The more young people you get involved, the more fun it is, the more you find people who you can relate to, and it's quite exciting, and then you end up having fun and engaging in politics that way. But I suppose blockers to voluntary time are quite a big challenge that we face because we're all busier and busier. I think commuter times have a real impact on that. And my entire career has been based on what I've ended up doing voluntarily, but I've made huge sacrifices to do that. And most of my friends think I'm mad. Like here today, I'm doing this for fun. So actually, you know, I think we just need to try and change that somehow and unlock, whether it's in workplaces that becomes more socially acceptable for people to actually take time off to go and do things like politics, where not only do you learn and bring that back to the workplace, but also you have that stake in the country and that stake in society. And then just sort of from that, I suppose, marketing. From the Conservative Party, we obviously have been appealing to older voters, but 1 in 6 Tory voters may actually die before the next election, which is a fairly harsh statistic. But if we can appeal to a generation that are now, like if you go into schools, everything they get about politics, all the information is on TikTok. And some of our MPs, fabulous as they are, and Mel, you're not including this, they don't really get it. They can't. I see some of those videos and I'm like, oh, wow. We need to learn how to engage with some of our younger voters without seeming a bit creepy, which is a real blocker as we have to navigate being effective on all these different mediums so that people can understand that actually capitalism and the message that we've got does apply to them, and it is quite exciting. It's something that they should be part of and come along. So just to echo again the comments of the rest of the panel, this isn't generations pitching against each other. We can do all of this in harmony, but we need to be flexing and developing as a party as we're looking inwards after the slightly devastating election result. And actually, just a few simple changes, I think, could mean that we bring that cohort who are naturally right-leaning on board.
Thank you very much for that, Lizzie. And I think actually your last comments there touched on something that I think all the panellists have addressed in some way, and I'd like to ask each to expand, which is that I suppose we often pitch the differences between younger and older voters as if they are in conflict. And perhaps in some ways they are, and on some political issues it feels like they certainly have been in recent years. But nonetheless, how similar does each of the panel think that the actual aspirations, the actual sort of policy desires of both younger and older voters and those in between actually are? And how easy do you think, whoever emerges on top of this sort of leadership contest, how easy would it be to actually produce a message that could appeal to both of those sides? And so I'll ask that to each of the panellists in turn. Mel.
Okay, so look, I think different age cohorts are different because there are different stages of their life, and I think if you're elderly and retired, you're concerned about security and dignity in old age and all of those kind of things. You, of course, care about younger generations because you'll have children possibly and grandchildren. If you're younger, you're at that stage of your life where you're out there in society and wanting to have a part of it, I think in the way that I described in my earlier comments. I totally agree that this should not be pitting one group against another. However, in a kind of economy that kind of grows rather anemically, inevitably what politicians always have to do, which are choices between one group and another, one policy and another, it does become something at least of a zero-sum game. So, for example, if we were to take the triple lock, and I think Paul mentioned some of the ways in which ageing in an ageing society is going to impact us all. The increasing cost of that, you could argue, is at the expense, for example, of levying loans on younger people that are going into higher education. But back to my point of what I said at the beginning, is that if we can unlock the magic of greater productivity, for example, in France, they are 18% more productive than we are. Their economy is about the same size. So that means that actually what the French produce, they do in 4 days, and we take 5 days to do it. So we just work harder. That's basically how we keep up with everybody else. One of the reasons why France has succeeded is not because it has the flexible labour markets that we have. Far from it. They're always out on strike or indeed kidnapping their CEOs to make their industrial point. And that's what they do. In fact, when they're on the march, they actually have a special sort of barbecues that are produced which fit on the tram lines so that they can push them along with the marches and sell the Frankfurters at the same time. And that's how geared up they are for sort of industrial unrest. So we beat them on that, but where we lose is on investment. So in France, the cost of electricity that the industries are using in homes is about half to, probably a quarter of the level that it is over here. Why? Because they invested heavily in nuclear and there was a big investment strategy there. You drive on French roads, they're infinitely better than ours, I'm afraid, and there are a lot more of them when it comes to motorways. You look at rail, it's a similar story. And you look at housing, you've got 36 million homes in France for a similar population to us, but we've got 30 million, and that's part of the pressure on housing for young people. So without going on for too long, what we've got to do is put into place the fiscal infrastructure that drives the kind of investment that leads us being more like France in terms of investment, while perhaps trying to hang on to the flexible labour markets more like the United States that we have over here. And then if we do it, we can have a wonderful situation when we can look after both ends of the age spectrum without any competition.
Ooh la la. I think you've been reading Foundations, have you?
To a degree I have, and I agree with every word. Certainly the barbecue was something that came from them. Yeah.
No, it's a splendid report. Anybody who hasn't
It is,
read it should go and see
Yeah.
it. Paul?
Well, I suppose it's about identifying that big picture place that people can all get behind, and everybody's mentioning those points, and the points about progress and growth are clearly areas where people can very effectively come together. I think most social and political and economic change is delivered by a combination of everybody putting their shoulders to the wheel in the best way that they possibly can. And I think that particularly talking to, I think sometimes this debate becomes immediately about the very old and the very young. Well, that's not really true, of course, because there's quite a whole bunch of people in the middle who are, on the whole, the people who are driving both progress and growth, economically, socially, and politically. So thinking about that group is just as important. And as I said, I think one of the really important audiences at this point is that over 50 age group. If your average voter is 64, well, why aren't you reaching more?
63 actually.
63.
It's not
Sorry.
that.
I think reaching more into that group of people who we are talking to a lot and are increasingly concerned about what their futures look like. It is a different story for each different generation. I think the other point is I think there's a space where people do work really effectively together. In fact, today an organisation called Intergenerational England has been launched, which is really about how you bring together the shared and common interests of what happens when younger and older people work together towards common goals and common aims. And I think there's real opportunity and potential to see that. And I think quite often in these debates, the older people's contribution is written off. And I think that's a dangerous thing to do, especially as older people are living longer. Their contributions continue to be quite substantial, and some of the skills and expertise that people have to bring into workplaces, into communities, I think is going to be incredibly valuable, especially at a time when there are other resource challenges elsewhere.
Splendid. Bobby?
Yeah, no, great question. So, I guess the starting point is that there's always differences between generations and age group, and the key question then becomes, is it different now? Are those gaps bigger or smaller than in the past? And I think on that, you do need to split it out into that kind of cultural, social group and the economic group. So on the cultural group, social attitudes, values, all those types of things. One of the key things that I learned, I wrote a book on generation divides and how divided we really were, is that if you look back in history, any era you go to will always think today's young are uniquely wrong and weird. And that you can go all the way back to Socrates, who hated the young people of his day, long diatribes against them being lazy and loving gossip in the place of activity, all of those types of things. It goes through every single era. But when I look at the data, the gaps between old and young today on social issues are no bigger than the gaps between old and young in the 1980s or 1970s on social issues. It's always the younger generation are about twice as comfortable with any emerging social norm than the older generation at that time. And that's a kind of really constant pattern. So this idea we've got uniquely social justice warrior snowflake generation coming through is not true. But then in contrast to that, the economic case is very different. And as Mel said, the big economic story of the last 20, 30 years is the growth in private wealth and relative to income as an important factor in economic success. But then within that, it's the concentration within a particular cohort, age cohort, is a new thing within the way economic growth has worked for people and wealth in particular. That concentration works. So that has shifted over time, and we shouldn't ignore that. We need to have ways to deal with that, and particularly because how that wealth flows down is going to be a key factor in how younger generations feel. And we may be baking in those types of inequalities in a way that we really don't want to see. But the final point I'd say is that conflict is not the real story about generations over the past 20 or 30 years. Separation is the real story about generations. So we are living more separately between age groups than we have at any point in human history. And they call it a dangerous experiment in age segregation in the US academic work. And it's much less recognised in the UK. But we did the same sort of analysis on the census data. And you look back to the 1980s and even 1991 census, and you looked all the way from villages up through small towns up to the core cities. And age groups were just as likely to be mixed in all of those different settlement types in the 80s and 90s. Same age gradient, same age profile in villages compared to core cities. And you roll that forward to 2001, 2011, 2020, 21 census, this huge drifting apart of the generations where cities are getting much younger, rural and smaller towns are getting much older, and that is new. And if you add digital separation onto that, digital lives becoming more important to us, and people are online doing different things to different intensities between the generations, we've got this sense of, we've got this real separation between the generations. So I would say as well, echoing what Paul said, when we do lots of work that brings generations together, including being connected to Intergenerational England, you can see that there isn't nearly as much gap as you'd think between the generations when you bring them together. There is much more in common. People have got much more similar priorities for the future. But it's just that separation gives this sense of stereotyping of the other side and misunderstanding between the two sides. So we've got to work really hard at bringing the generations together because these broader social and economic forces are pushing us apart in a way I don't think we've really fully recognised.
As an urban Tory who blogs for a living, I'm quite familiar with quite a few of those trends. Finally, Lizzie.
So just to go down a sort of anti-separation route, so actually for my teenage years I was brought up by my grandparents, and if we're talking about things that can appeal, the Conservatives can do to appeal to all ages, it's not a particularly sexy answer, but I think competence. Like Granny and I would literally sit there and I would moan because the bus got cancelled and she would moan because of a pothole. You know, we just want trains that work, we want low public debt, we want access to services, and actually I think, you know, that is one thing which all of the different generations actually can believe in and we should be delivering as a party, and probably, I would say, is one of the reasons for such devastating election defeat.
On that slightly cheery note, I will turn things over to the audience. So the lady on the end there.
My name is Shaliwa from Kingston and Surbiton. So regarding the differences between the generation and all that, and the fact that the research shows that there isn't a significant difference when you look across, years, decades apart. However, I think there is a unique difference in this generation because of social media and the ease of communication and the bandwagon effect. So I'll give for an example. I think just 2 weeks ago, we went leafleting in a university. The moment you came across the first person who refused the leaflet, then everybody else that came with that person, students, would refuse to for no apparent reason. And then the moment you come across someone that breaks that cycle and takes it, then everybody else is queuing up to collect it. So I think, to be honest, I'm thinking there's a way that the Conservative can ride on this bandwagon effect. I'm not saying the younger generation are not thinking through things, but to be honest, most often than not, when you get into a conversation as to why they dislike or like a particular thing, take any topic, for example, you don't really get...
Madam, sorry, we do need to get through a few other questions, so could you sort of bring to a point? Sorry.
So my summary is this. There is a unique difference because of the impact of social media. How can the Conservative Party ride on that, the bandwagon effect, and just get them loving the party?
Splendid. The question of social media. Is anybody on the panel particularly? Yeah, Lizzie, would you like to?
So this is actually, so my day job is phone-free spaces for all the reasons that you've listed. So basically, as younger people, we're not giving them the skills whilst the phones are constantly there the entire time and social media is so influential to learn how to just engage properly face-to-face. And so actually, talk about snowflake generation, you know, this is causing huge anxiety and they're not going to be going up into adulthood and engaging properly in society. And it causes huge loneliness. I know that's obviously an issue that also impacts the elderly, but if you're not spending time genuinely having proper quality human interaction, then you are going to be much more easily influenced. And again, I said about TikTok being the main source of information about politics, because you're not being challenged, you're not getting out and seeing alternative views, which I think is really, really dangerous. And going into schools, as I mentioned earlier, the views are so polarized. Girls tend to be really quite left-wing, and the boys now, the reason Reform is doing so well is because it's quite easy politics, isn't it? It's we must do that, and there's no understanding of the depths of nuance. No one reads long-form pieces anymore. I think we just, as a society, need to be looking at the devastating impact that social media is having and actually what's going to happen when this generation go out into the real world and how can we empower them to manage that.
Actually, just following on to that, Paul, I know sort of loneliness is an issue that AGK focuses on especially, and obviously there's that question there about social media as a driver of loneliness amongst younger people. Even if it has sort of different roots, do you see that as dealing with loneliness as an issue that can unite both younger and older generations? Is that sort of element of bringing them together?
Yeah, I mean, I think two points on this. First of all, bringing people who are isolated together, whatever age they are, I think is really important. And we have a brilliant telephone friendship service where a lot of younger people volunteer to befriend older people. But what the younger people say is it helps alleviate their loneliness and isolation as well as the isolation of the older people. So let's bring people together in that way. And social media, it's as is all I think is often the case, is that can be the force for good and it can be the force for ill. And if you've ever gone to see Grand Talk on TikTok, you will see older people doing extraordinary things on TikTok and having a lot of fun. So I think there's a way of creating that sense. Social media creates a sense of connection. But I think Lizzie, absolutely agree with Lizzie. Lizzie's point is that actually you also need to create the physical space for people to connect and reduce and alleviate isolation. And in that sense, a lot of older people bring that wisdom and experience of being able to do that because that's what they've been doing for most of their lives. So actually the combination of the two can be really powerful, and that transition out from almost transitioning from a social media space into a physical space is where the power of community, the power of place, the power of environment can really bring old and young together through a whole variety of different means. So I think there's an awful lot of potential to create that platform for community and community growth, as well as reducing and alleviating the loneliness and isolation that many people in different generations face.
The importance of the little platoons, as somebody once said. Another question, please. This gentleman on the end here.
Thank you. Alistair Stewart, I'm a councillor in Croydon. The previous Labour government ruined final salary pensions for anyone outside the public sector. And this government, there's lots of rumours about what they might do in terms of removing tax relief or perhaps employers having to pay national insurance on their pension contributions. If this generation of young people are about more personal responsibility, as Professor Duffy said, is there not an argument that we should be making that we're not only the party of accumulating capital in your working life, but we are also the party that allows you to save to have a good later life when you retire?
Splendid. I think, Mel, you're best equipped to speak on the subject of pensions of any of us.
Yeah, so I think you raise a very important point. I mean, look, across the public sector, I think we have reached the point where defined benefit pensions is a huge fiscal challenge and cannot be ignored. We wait to see what the government may or may not say about that. I have concerns that on October the 30th, one of the things that may be announced is that pension contributions may actually attract tax relief not at the full rate but at the marginal rate, and therefore will be very expensive for those who are not on the basic rate of income tax. Now, this is pretty much the kind of stuff that Gordon Brown did back in the day, if you remember, in 1997, where it was all kept very quiet and then suddenly did, I think it was a £118 billion hit to pensions across the country. The reason why I'm nervous about it is what, of course, the government did during the general election, at our behest, in fact, was to get narrowed into a series of taxes upon which they could draw to meet the so-called black hole and all the other things that they need to do, which left about £100 billion worth of tax-raising capacity, right at the centre of which actually is exactly the issue that you've raised. So I have my doubts as to whether we're all going to be feeling very happy about the pension landscape at the end of October.
Sort of moving out from the sort of specific political circumstance of that, Bobby, do you have any thoughts on that sort of the party of sort of wealth sort of accumulation or sort of capital accumulation sort of element to that question?
Yeah, when we first started doing work on this about 15, 20 years ago, one of the things from all the focus groups and the surveys was just how important a sense of contribution was to all generations, that people should be rewarded for paying in for so long. And there's kind of like, there's a real strong sense among younger generations that older generations need to be supported because they've been paying in. That we've got a very strong sense. It is a kind of classic British sense of fairness that if you've been paying in for so long, you should be able to take the benefits from that. So I think that is not at odds with younger people's starting position on how you and why you see quite a level of support for continuing support for pensioners in the UK. So I think that combined with that strong sense of personal responsibility among that generation, that actually no one's going to come and help you out, you've got to work for yourself, is a pretty solid offer for younger generations.
Splendid. Another question. The lady at the back here.
Thank you. Is the Conservative Party an ostrich in the sand? I mean, this room should be full. We need young people, right? How are we supposed to get re-elected in 5 years if we don't attract young people? And I am feeling across this conference that we are not addressing the change that we need to bring. If you look at the benches, the first thing that struck me, the first thing that I was absolutely shocked by, when you look to the Conservative bench, 121 MPs, 121, 29 are women. They all look the same. How do we attract younger, more diverse, more tenacious, different types of people with different thinking? Has the Conservative Party is it the ostrich in the sand?
Mel and then Lizzie, would you like to comment?
So I think to a degree we do the kind of things that I think I and others on this panel have been suggesting to reach out to those particular cohorts. I think Lizzie made a very important point, which is one of the things that turns young people off. It's the same thing that turns off people irrespective of their age, which was that we spend a lot of time in government fighting ourselves and embroiled in our own often petty self-indulgences rather than worrying about the more noble aspirations of the electorate, if I can put it that way. We lost a lot of trust around things like Partygate and Bettinggate and all these things, and we ran a disastrous election campaign in which we had a Prime Minister that sadly came back too early from Normandy, got rained on when he announced the election, had a PPS that went and gambled on the outcome of the election, and I was the poor guy that was sent out on 25% of the morning media rounds to explain to Laura Koonsberg that actually there was nothing to see here and it was all perfectly normal, and what was the problem? So I think if we can start to be what I call broadly an effective opposition, then I think some of these problems will start to lift more naturally. And by effective opposition, I mean really focusing on the things that matter to people, rather than going for that kind of knee-jerk reaction that a lot of oppositions have, which is to jump on every single issue and say it's wrong, and this is wrong, and that's wrong. I think we've got to be very careful not to do that. With fuel payment, we should have gone in deep, and we have done. There'll be many opportunities around the budget to do likewise. But if we can be united, effective, and people can start to believe us again, so when we talk about things for young people, they actually think, they might deliver it, then I think you will see more young people in the audience when that has occurred. But it is a tough journey. None of these things are going to happen. There's no magical ideological square on which we can leap. now to solve all our problems. It's going to be years of hard work.
Hopefully,
And years, I mean years.
but hopefully more opportunities to bring young people on board and more opportunities for you to do the morning meeting around Mel.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no.
Lizzie.
Pick up the bit.
So just a point on the sort of intake of MPs. From a candidate's point of view, youth's quite a tricky one because you kind of have to learn your trade. I think I look at my own development every year, like I do get a bit, believe it or not, I have improved. But you do kind of need that time to grow as a politician before I think you're ready to genuinely go in and contribute at quite a high level. And we do need high caliber candidates. But also it's bloody expensive. Like seriously, you know, to even just driving around everywhere or taking time out, you have to make those sacrifices. And that is a real barrier that I think all parties are suffering with. And then just on the point of women, like I think it is tougher for women. You do get sort of savage comments all the time, and I mean this is a tough world. But should it be? And how do we again attract younger and particularly younger females into something where you're like, yeah, you're going to get attacked. No one's going to like you, but well tried. And then if you don't do very well, you're out. So try marketing, sell that one.
No. Yes. So another round of questions, please. The gentleman at the front here.
It's Brian from Somerset. My question is about, reflects back on Lizzie's original comments about how unlikely it is that younger voters are supporting us at the moment. And my question is there any experience from people on the panel about international comparisons? Is this something which we expect in other Western countries? And if so, if it's more uniquely Britain, is that because of the wealth concentration that the older people have got that Bobby reflected?
Bobby, would you like to start us off on that one?
Yeah, look, there's all sorts of patterns around the world, and I don't think that this is set in stone. And I don't want to keep coming back to the cultural point, but it is an important aspect of this, is having much more focus on the economic future and trying to build that sense of a brighter future of generation on generation progress is the crux to this, because otherwise you do get, I think you've got choices here of going down that Republican Democrat type route of quite zero, it is zero-sum game, because in the end no one wins a culture war. You just get two tribal identities facing off against each other, and it splits the population, and it continues to split the population. And we can see elements of that appearing in some parts of Europe. We even saw elements of it in Australia, where it became a quite generational battle and brought in lots of those types of cultural things. But people are trying to row back from that, and I think that's the key choice here, rowing back from that sense of cultural division into something that is more economic and more hopeful for a future that isn't just about one generation, but connects the generations.
I suppose Conservative leadership candidates shouldn't aim to sort of imitate Gilly in the Apple Estate on the cultural front. But on that particular question about international comparisons, Paul, in your sort of work at Age UK, do you often see sort of similar challenges like this across, Age France, etc.? Or is this a sort of specific UK problem, this squaring of the circle issue?
I don't know enough about it, but I certainly think that there are some similarities in different societies. I mean, the American situation has its own demographic dimension. So you do have to look at the demographics of each particular country. Western European countries tend to have, broadly speaking, quite similar demographics, and therefore the political issues there are some similar issues, but also huge differences. I mean, I think the sort of broad, point that Bobby was making earlier is also about how do we think about a narrative that's about fairness for people, because I think fairness is something that people do see as being quite important, and that's certainly something that we are seeing in other countries. I think Australia and New Zealand have been quite interesting in that context, and I think in this country, in the UK, fairness is a concept that actually a lot of people do kind of gravitate around.
Splendid. Another question, please. I think the gentleman at the front's had his hand up a few times. So.
Thank you, Devon Galani from Policy and Practice. We do a lot of work helping pensioners on low incomes tap into pension credit and other support. And I guess the question is it really about age, or is it partly about wealth, right? So you've got very well-off pensioners who are really upset at losing the winter fuel payment, but actually probably kind of collectively that's not necessarily the worst thing in the world from a political perspective. And then you've got younger people where, you know, if you're a person on a low income, the amount of support you get from the state is, you know, if you're 68, you get 2.4 times as much support from the state versus if you're 64. And it's kind of a striking difference, right? So, and that probably applies at the middle income range. I'm just talking about the lowest income households as well. So so turn that into a question if you like. But, you know, that is it more about wealth than it is about age?
Mel, do you have thoughts on that?
I think it is about wealth in the sense that wealth is kind of an accumulation of income, in a sense, isn't it? And we've talked about the disparity of wealth between older generations and how they've passively acquired that compared to younger generations who have less of it and are relying on income. In your example about the 68-year-old and the 64-year-old, are you including the impact of the state pension that's being received by the former rather than the latter, or is that? Right. Yeah. 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 So I think in terms of the way that welfare feeds into the different age cohorts, it's probably trying to do different things. So there's a recognition with older people who are retired that it's very difficult for them to change their economic circumstances by going out maybe and getting a job and supplementing their income. Whereas for somebody who, for example, has fallen unemployed and is very young, the expectation is that the welfare state isn't there necessarily to support them in being out of the workplace, it's to encourage them to get into the workplace, and therefore the amounts of money involved would be rather less. I mean, the basic level of universal credit for somebody under 25, and I always raise this figure with people who say, well, it's everybody sitting around all these generous benefits, is about £3,500 a year. I mean, it is peanuts, okay? And if you're over 25, it's about £4,500 a year. Now, fine, you can always find examples where you load people up with lots of children and housing issues and disability and things and get some quite big, exceptional numbers. But by and large, it is relatively low. But there is a reason for that. Now, the question as to whether that balance is right is a good one, and I don't have an immediate answer to it. But you've planted a thought in my head, so I should have a think about it. Thank you.
Very good. Another question? The lady here in green.
Hi, Sue Chan from The Telegraph. Does the panel think that a 25-year-old today will still enjoy the benefits of the triple lock on pensions?
Lizzie?
No.
Simple answer. Mel?
Okay, well, that gets to the heart of, you know, the extent to which you think we should be supporting people at that stage of their life. No, and I totally understand that. But to go to the question, I think it's a very open question because it begs another question, which is what is the economy and the workplace going to look like in 40-odd years' time? Which, in terms of the rate of change that's going on, technologically and artificial intelligence, for example, is just going up a curve like that, and we don't quite know what it's going to look like. So I think it's quite conceivable in 40 years' time, actually, that you'll probably be able to choose whether you work or not, and you'll probably be able to choose whether to take a very large income, which is available to everybody, or not. I think the change could be as dramatic as that. So I think, in a sense, maybe things like the triple lock will become largely irrelevant in 40-odd years' time.
My instinct with AI is that we'll either become very rich or very dead. I can't really
I'm more
it's
of
going
an
to land at the
optimist.
moment.
I mean, yeah. I mean, I'll give you an example. I had the AI unit, which I built outside my office when I was Secretary of State at Work and Pensions. And we were doing things like, for example, DWP receives 20,000 letters a day, okay? They were read using AI in 2 hours, and we were able to fish out and prioritise those where there were probably vulnerable people that were writing. And that's just one example. And in the job centre, we had an approach whereby you could actually test AI listening into the interaction between the job coach, work coach, and the benefit recipient, and then come up with the best recommendations at the end as to what the next step should be based on hundreds of thousands of conversations that were similar, and therefore leveraging the ability of the work coach to do their job. You're going to see that eating into areas of the economy where lawyers, more sophisticated people in the past who have been at a level in the workplace where probably they haven't been affected so much by these changes, I think will be affected quite profoundly. But I'm more optimistic about AI than some.
Do any of the panel, I haven't spoken on this, have thoughts particularly on the triple lock subject? I mean, Paul, is that?
Well, obviously, we support the triple lock for older people here and now, but I think the important point is to start to take a much bigger picture about what kind of world and society do we really want to live in. We want to live in a world which is thinking about, which is starting to open up these debates. It's a great question, by the way, because it opens up the debates about what does that longer term society look like? And Chris Whitty's report tells us that, that there will be an existential challenge facing the care of older people in 2043 because of the population and demographic shifts. How are we going to respond to that in this particular context? We do really need to have that longer term view about where do we fuel and equip society to be able to look after our oldest people and an ageing population. How do we think about the contribution that older people, already making as unpaid carers in other circumstances, but also as contributors to the economy in the longer term as well? So these are how we start to open up, I think, a much bigger debate. 40 years ago, I suspect this conference was probably not debating anything called the triple lock at all, because there was just a set of assumptions about what your later life was going to look like. That turned out to be pretty wrong.
Can I just come back in very quickly? I think one thing we shouldn't lose sight of was that before 2010, there were 200,000 more pensioners in absolute poverty than there were by the time that we had reached the end of our term in office. Pensioner poverty was a deep, deep, deep problem back in the day. It's now still a problem, but it's not as big a problem. One of the reasons why it's less of a problem is because of the triple lock. The second point I would make, though, is if you look at the fiscal risks and sustainability report that the OBR produces, they do indeed map what the consequences of continuously uprating by the higher of the three metrics in the triple lock. And of course, in the end, it asymptotically approaches the entire output of the UK economy, right? So that's where it will end up in the long run. Okay, so there is a point at which it clearly becomes unsustainable. Why is it that we keep leaning into the triple lock? Well, to a degree, it's because there are a lot of older people and they do vote. Okay, so there's a political dynamic involved there. So interestingly, in the context of this conversation, if we reach the point where we're actually being supported by younger people in greater numbers, there may not be that political imperative to continue to do that ad infinitum, which may not please Paul so much, but may be the reality of where we head.
Well, I suppose just asking you on this, probably. I mean, leaving aside the sort of fiscal practicalities, it strikes me the triple lock, has become quite a talking point because, when you are like myself on a sort of reasonable salary, but still shoveling up 700 quid a month to live in a box room in South London, and you hear that pensioners are being given a big bung every year in line with inflation, etc. That naturally creates quite a sense of anger. But it strikes me that just sort of going and scrapping it or pledging to scrap it, attacks that sort of fairness question that you mentioned earlier.
Yeah, which is why you don't see absolutely riots in the streets from young people about this is really unfair, because it is in many ways it is unfair to those cohorts, and it kind of that lack of kicking back from young people is partly related to that individualism, and actually they don't expect very much in terms of sport, but it is also connected to those other points of contribution and fairness, sense of contribution and fairness, and also love for their parents and grandparents. And you've got to remember that we are more deeply connected up and down the generations than we are across the generations. And then the final point, which I pick out in the book, in these kind of factors that connect them, is we don't have very many indicators of how we're going to be treated as old people, apart from how we treat old people today. So it's actually a very important indicator to us now, how we're treating old people currently, because it's our only indicator of how we're going to get treated in the future. And I would say, just on that point of the 40 years, I'm Gen X. No one ever talks about Gen Xers. I think Paul was saying we're the middle forgotten generation in this, but there's some inbuilt structural things already going to happen in a much shorter time frame than 40 years, where 80% of pre-war and baby boomer generations owned their own home. It looked like Gen X was going to race up to meet them, got deflected by the huge price rises and then financial crash. And it's going to be 2/3 of Gen X who own their own home by the time they get to retirement. So that's going to hugely increase housing costs for them. So we built in, and then millennials have only just got over 50% ownership level. So we're building in lots higher costs and lots more instability into these generations that are going to come through long before we get to that 40-year decision timeframe. So we have to address it. It's going to come in the next 10, 15 years, and it will take some bravery to engage in those types of conversations, but from an understanding that we're interconnected, not fighting each other all the time.
And that's quite a good note, I think, on which to bring things to a close. But I was just thinking, Paul, would you like some final reflections based on
Yeah, I mean, it's been a great conversation, and I hope it helps everyone to start to think about the longer term, because whether it's the longer term, as your Mel's point about the longer term in the electoral cycle, or the longer term when we're thinking about the kind of country we want to live in, then the opportunities around thinking, the words that feel like they've really resonated have been about progress, have been about fairness, have been about growth, and those are things that young and old are equally interested in.
Splendid. And on that bombshell, we shall bring things to a close. Ladies and gentlemen, please can we have a round of applause for our wonderful panellists. See more of you at more Conservative Home events.